Well, as Kathy mentioned, I have been doing these reviews for about 15 years, and one of the really delightful things about doing it is that every once in a while I'll be able to discover a new author. And about 13 years ago, I was fortunate enough to come across Mariana's first Fay Longchamp novel, and basically fell in love with it at first sight. I've reviewed, I believe, about 9 of them now, and it is my pleasure really to introduce her this evening. I should also mention that the Fay Longchamp Mysteries have been awarded several literary awards over the years, including the Benjamin Franklin Award, Mississippi Author Award, and 3 book awards from the state of Florida. Mariana is an assistant professor of professional writing at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, where she teaches both fiction and nonfiction writing. Mariana earned a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Rutgers-Camden quite recently, but before that earned a Bachelor of Science in Engineering Physics and a Master of Science in Chemical Engineering, areas that I know absolutely nothing about and am just sort of blown over by people who are expert in those sorts of fields. She is still licensed to practice engineering in the state of Florida. She's also the co-author of scholarly articles and a book on mathematical literacy, and she's co-authored an environmental engineering continuing education course. In 2016, she published 2 essays on environmental topics, and she developed and taught a course on writing environmental essays. And possibly most importantly for our purposes this evening, she is currently working on her 10th Fay Longchamp Archaeology Mystery, which I believe you said may be coming out about next February of 2017. I'm obviously looking forward to that. Please welcome Mariana Evans.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm very honored to speak to a group I think of probably mostly archaeologists. I'm, as he said, an engineer and a writer, and I blundered into, in the middle of my career, a subfield of math and science literacy when I met a professor of young adult literacy, and we felt like all of our expertise came together in a special synergy. And that encounter ended up with a couple of peer-reviewed articles on math and science literacy and a book that we co-wrote called Mathematical Literacy in the Middle and Secondary Grades. In the course of writing these things, we realized that teachers are being required by No Child Left Behind to bring writing into the math and science classroom, math and science into the writing classrooms, but nobody really tells them how to do that. And at the time we wrote the book, there wasn't anything really out there like it. So in order to feel our way into this fairly new field for both of us, it was an interesting process that I took a step back to say, well, how do I do what I do? And how does it draw from my background in the sciences? And I have to tell you that every day I come up with a new way that my work in the arts draws from my education in the sciences. And I enjoyed that synergy, and I would like to foster it. So the topic at hand is particularly about my books, which are based in archaeology. And there is a very thriving subfield in archaeological crime fiction that is about, in crime fiction that is about archaeology, and which is interesting when you think about it. And so, to prepare for this talk, I asked myself, why? Why are there so many mysteries about archaeology? And so, you have to just out of the gate say the Indiana Jones effect cannot be denied. People like Indiana Jones, they like the romance of it all, they like the swashbuckling nature that is probably not the way it really is to be an archaeologist, but it's fun. So there's the fun aspect of it. I think for all archaeological fiction, but especially crime fiction, there's an allure to the treasure hunt. We read mysteries because of that unknown that sucks you in and you want to know the answer. And archaeology just adds another layer to that of, what are you going to find when you dig? What are you going to find in the bowels of that museum? So I think there's just the treasure hunt aspect. And then from my point of view as the writer, something that has become more and more clear to me over the years is that archaeology gives my heroine a reason to be out looking for trouble. When you write a series of mystery novels, at some point someone might ask, why does your interior designer keep stumbling over dead bodies? You know, it doesn't happen to most of us all the time. Archaeologists are out looking for things, and sometimes those things are dead bodies. So it means that it's just a little more plausible. My stories are a little bit more rooted in the real world, and my heroine has an excuse to be doing what she's doing. I was naive when I started writing. I didn't even realize that mystery readers expected a series. So I wrote the first book all out, gave it my all, and thought that was it. And when the publisher, that first book got a couple of awards, it did well, and the publisher says, you want to do another one? And I go, sure. And the idea did come to me, but part of the reason that I've been able to have a long series is because my archaeologist is a deep and interesting character who's out looking for trouble, digging up trouble. And so also more broadly, not just archaeologists, but other kinds of scientists crop up again and again in fiction, not just crime fiction. And when I was doing the literature coursework for my Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, they want you to know what came before. So we were reading classic novels from the early 20th century, and I would find extended metaphors based in science that you would not expect to find in Virginia Woolf, perhaps. And it was modernism. It was the time that science was coming to the fore. And I actually wrote a paper in graduate school about science in unexpected places in fiction. And I think it appeals to a certain kind of mind, creative mind. And also I find that when I'm writing fiction, you know, it's no secret that you have to get your readers to suspend their disbelief. You have to make them believe that your character has stumbled over the 10th dead body. And so for me, science and also history, things that are rooted in fact, I think it allows me to build a framework of a story that people can believe. They know that the physics works. They can feel it even if they don't know physics. They know that the history feels accurate. They can go to Google and check it. And so I create a world that makes some sense. And then when I get into the more fanciful parts of the story, people go more easily with me, I think. So now that we've established a link between science and fiction, I like to think of the discipline of science and the art of writing as being the two rails of my career. And I also like to think of the discipline of writing and the art of science. I think they have more in common than we understand them to have. And so I want to backtrack a bit and take you through my journey to get from science to writing. Because it has given me a lot of insight in my work in science literacy to see how the two have worked together for me. So I promise that the two tracks do come together at the end, but I want to back up a little bit in time and talk about how I got to this point in the career. So I have a lot of thanks for my father, who spent a lot of my childhood saying, no education is ever wasted. I'm sure that was not original to him, but it resonated for him, it resonated for me. I think that it might not have been ordinary in 1961 to start a college fund for a girl child in Mississippi, but my parents did. I was raised to be an educated person and a curious person. I have a lot of gratitude for that, and I think it brought me to both science and writing. My mother, who also believed that no education was ever wasted, but the other aspect of her personality that was key was her curiosity. There's a story of her when she was 4 years old, and she and her cousin were having quite a fight over a worm they had found because she wanted to cut it up and see how it worked, and he wasn't so sure that was the best idea. And that story followed her around for the rest of her life. She became a nurse, which is what girls who were interested in science did in the 1950s. And so I was brought up with a woman who was going to find out how something worked, which is the very root of science. And so this is my childhood, basis in education. Curiosity was an important factor, and then an innate practicality, which led me, directly to science, but it also led me to writing. And I don't know that's a recipe for both of those things to me, and I find them very important. And also, a reverence for history came into play. This picture was taken somewhere in the American South, somewhat time before the First World War, because the longleaf pine forest of the American South was flattened before the end of the First World War. It was gone by 1917. So the destruction of a forest that reached from Virginia to Texas was a notable fact. They had the portable vehicles to flatten the forest. They built the temporary rail lines that you can see. They built temporary sawmills. And then once the trees were gone, they packed it all up and moved to the next patch of trees. I grew up on the site of one of those sawmills. You would have thought that after 50 years there'd be nothing left, and this is where we get into the archaeology part. There was quite a bit of remnants of that sawmill. There was a huge pile of sawdust at the bottom of the hill. There were logging roads through the woods, and they were still paved with half timbers. And there was a strip of grass where the grass wouldn't grow, where the rail lines, the temporary spurs, had been. And so, about 50 years later, sometime during the Vietnam War, we bought that house. That's me in the knee socks. The strip of land where the grass didn't grow is just on the other side of the driveway, and the logging roads went back into the trees. The trees came back pretty well in 50 years. There was a house on the site in between that apparently the people watched the trees grow. So the archaeology part of all that is my mother found the trash pit and the privy for the sawmill and the house, and she excavated them. And I still have some of the things she dug up. They're family treasures. She walked those old roads and found debris thrown here and there. She walked the old rail line. She found the gravel pits in the woods that they had used to build the roads. And in the gravel pits, she found what she was pretty sure, we never had an expert look at it, but she was pretty sure she found the remnants of flint knapping. She found finished points. She found things that she thought were probably points that didn't quite make it. They weren't quite good enough. And the raw material, the flint. And then after Hurricane Camille came through in 1969 and stirred all that up, she walked it again. And I remember walking behind her through the woods, and I'm not a finder. I gave that gift to my character, Faye Longchamp, in my books. My mother was a finder. And so I walked right past a downed tree with the root ball almost as tall as I was. And my mother walked along behind me and picked up a spear point that was laying right on top. I have that too. Is it any wonder that I write about archaeology? I had her, and we went to the bookmobile every summer and got all the books about archaeology. And I tell my writing students that when you live your life, you're putting creative material into a well, and it will be there when you reach in and need something to write about. I teach in a writing program. I think writing programs are valuable, but I tell them that that's not all of their education, or else they'll only write about writers. And so, thanks to my mother, I had enough grounding in at least a fascination in archaeology that I could go to experts, I could go to written material and craft stories that at least make some degree of sense about archaeology. The first book got an award from the Florida Historical Society, which scared me to death because I'm going, don't they know I made it up? And they did. They give one award for fiction, and I was very honored to receive it. So during all this time, Daddy would periodically say, and you can join with me, no education is ever wasted, especially when you're a writer. You got to have something to draw from. So I took him seriously. It was a little nerdy, I guess. I was into English, obviously, math, band, physics, the piano, not chemistry because the chemistry teacher was known to think girls were stupid. My sister and I both avoided him. I have a master's in chemical engineering. She has a PhD in analytical chemistry. He knows this. mechanical drawing, all of it. I might have enjoyed majoring in piano, but we're practical people, and engineering seemed like a good way to put food on the table when I needed to, and I have. And I loved it. It's like solving puzzles every day. You know, it's like figuring out the way the world works. And so I enjoyed my classwork a great deal, and I enjoyed the experiences it brought me. And those of you who may have read the books will start to see where I'm going with this, because you'll start to see things that crop up in the books. But the one thing that was interesting about my engineering career was the time and the place. It was 1979. It was Ole Miss. There had been a few engineering majors at that time, but they must have been very lonely. They were always alone. We were in the first class that had a critical mass. There were 5 of us in the chemical engineering class. It was an interesting time. I was told that they had to convert the faculty lounge because there was no women's room in the engineering building at Ole Miss at that time. I believe this because it was, for Ole Miss at that time, it was a nice bathroom. It had a little lounge with some old furniture in it, and so I think it was where the faculty used to hang out, and they had to give it to us. So it was an interesting time. I've written about it in my essays, and I've written about this in my archaeology. I worked offshore for Mobil Oil between my sophomore and junior years. I'm sorry. And so and it looked a great deal like this. I worked for Mobil. They had us come into New Orleans. They told us that we would be engineering assistants, my roommate and I, that we would be on the same platform, and that we would work under an engineer to train for our eventual job later. This was all a lie. We were not on the same platform. There was no engineer out there. We were not engineering assistants. We worked on the crew. We chipped paint, we painted, we fetched tools. And we were told that we would spend a lot of time on these workboats from which we would have to swing on ropes to get back onto the platform. And I was a 95-pound weakling, and I was pretty sure I would die. And so I was on the phone to my father that night, sitting on the floor weeping, I have to come home, I can't do this. And Daddy said, you can come home, or you can go out. It was 7 days on, 7 days off. You can go out for a week, and if you don't like it, then you can come home. So I did, and then I wound up spending the whole summer. It has cropped up in my work, and it was an experience I wouldn't trade. So again, you have to put experiences in the well. And then I went to graduate school, and I worked as an environmental engineer. Again, those of you who've read the books will know where that comes in. This came from my company website. I'm not actually sure that's me, but it could be me there in the yellow shirt. And this was the contamination assessment work that we did. Underground storage tanks, hazardous waste work, remediation design. And it was fascinating work. I really loved that work. And again, I've used it quite a lot. But I had 3 children shortly after that, and I decided to stay home with my children. But I feel like I always needed something for myself, and that was my writing. So when they were napping, when they were at tennis practice, I would write. And after quite a number of years, because that's slow work, my first book came out. And I found that the logic that I learned in science really comes home when you try to do any large project that requires planning, even a novel. So even though you would not think chemical engineering and novel writing were related at all, the cause and effect, which is just ingrained into your psyche by the time you get out of engineering school, stood me in good stead. And so I finished the first book. It was called Artifacts, and it draws very heavily from my mother's amateur archaeological career. My character she's digging in the woods, not officially, and she was an interesting character who came to me while I was driving down the highway. I was driving down I-10, which is like the most boring stretch of road in the world, at least east of the Mississippi. And I started picturing an old plantation house in the woods, abandoned, and I thought, who would live there? And I came up with a character who was not what you would imagine as the debutante that inherited a plantation house. This is a woman who has no money, but she has this house that's a money pit. and she inherited it from the side of her family who had been enslaved, who had built the house. And I thought this was an interesting story for the 21st century that recognizes the reality of slavery. And so pretty soon I decided she would be even more interesting if she was also descended from the masters who lived in the house. And so that was the genesis of Faye Longchamp, who has that internal conflict that will never go away, and a fascination with history because of who she is. She's also just a little bit Creek or Muskogee. And I call Faye a piece of shrapnel from the great explosion that happened here in 1492. She has an angle on American history that nobody else really has because of her family history. She's now supported 9 books. I'm writing the 10th. I have a lot more stories left for Faye to tell. The second book, if we keep with the science theme, draws heavily from geology. My parents took us to a place called Red Bluff, which is not ordinary for Mississippi. I don't know that there's any place else like this in Mississippi, perhaps not east of the Mississippi River. It's an erosional feature near the Pearl River, and it's a great redneck thing to do, to take a bus full of kids and turn them loose on Red Bluff, to play, to climb, to play in the creek at the bottom. And so the geology of Red Bluff comes to play in my second book, Relics, because I gave my characters a similar place. I called it Great Tiger Bluff because I think it kind of looks like a tiger. And so the geology crept into the second book along with the archaeology. And for the history buffs among you, which may be everybody, this historical map is very old. I think it's before New Orleans, if you can see. It's probably before Mobile. There are no towns on it. There's the location of the various tribes. And I can't blow it up big enough so that you can see it, but just below the middle of the map on the Pearl River, it's labeled Red Cliffs. So before anything that we know of was in Mississippi, they knew where Red Bluff was. And I just found that to be fascinating. And so the gravel pits behind my house, where people made stone tools a long time ago, came into play in effigies, which is set in the Choctaw Nation in Mississippi. This is the Mother Mound of the Choctaw on the cover. And the book opens at the Mother Mound of the Choctaw. And the murder weapon in this book is a stone tool. My second lead, Faye's best friend, is a flint knapper, so this makes him a suspect. And then one of the archaeologists in the book, his specialty was taking the debris left behind and learning about the people who did the flint knapping in ancient times. So this came directly from the time I spent in the woods with my mother exploring the gravel pits. We were also taught quite a lot about history, and my mother loaded a bunch of brownies and Girl Scouts into school buses and took us to the battlefield at Vicksburg, which is quite a sobering place. If you ever want to think about what war can do, Vicksburg is the place. And so those memories, tied with the archaeological memories, come out in findings because I have Civil War reenactors in this book. I have a historical character who's a dignitary in the Confederate government who's having second thoughts about the cause that he serves, writing home to his wife, who he may never see again. And that relationship made this book special to me because I didn't even know it was about until I finished it. And this is where the subconscious comes into play when you write fiction. Because my first 3 books, I knew what they were about. They were about justice. That's what crime fiction is, an exploration of justice, an exploration of the notion that what is just is not always what is legal. What is just is not always what is moral. And I felt like I did quite a lot with those questions in the first 3 books. I wrote all the findings thinking that I was exploring the same questions, only to find that this book is about love. There is no character in this book, good or evil, who is not touched by romantic love for good or ill. And I had to write the book to find out that that's what I was writing. So I find the process of writing still fascinating after all these years. It took me 5 books to write about engineers because people think we're boring. we're not, but you have to take that into account. And so finally in Floodgates, I wrote about engineering. Floodgates is about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It's set about 3 years after the storm. And I approached my editor to say, I want to write about Katrina. I want to write about New Orleans. And she goes, New Orleans has already been done. You should do Baton Rouge. And I go, Baton Rouge has all the charm of a government city surrounded by oil refineries because that is what it is. I don't want to do Baton Rouge. And I don't argue with my editor much because I'm afraid of her. When I talk about this book among mystery readers, they all know Barbara, and they go, "Oh yeah, we know why you're afraid of her." But I have apparently touched a maternal chord with Barbara over the years because she signs my emails XOXO now. But anyway, I was a little afraid, but I wanted to do this book, and so I said, I know New Orleans has been done before, but Katrina was different in New Orleans than it was anywhere else because it was a flood. And you can no longer do archaeology in New Orleans without going through a layer of history that we remember, but it's still history, and it will always be there. And she liked that. She's listening, but I haven't convinced her yet. So and we're doing all this by email. So I decided I'm going to try one more time, and then I'm going to quit because I'm afraid of Barbara. And so I said, I know New Orleans has already been done, and Katrina has already been done, but I don't think it's been done by a licensed engineer with a family history in New Orleans, a personal history in New Orleans, a work history in New Orleans, who just might have something to say about those levee failures. And she said, oh, okay, you can do it, but I hate the title. Send me 100 pages and we'll decide about the title. So the first 100 pages, I set up the history of engineering in New Orleans because we had to have a city there, but you shouldn't have a city there. And so the military engineers who served in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, and then all the way to the present, these people have built levees and dikes and dug tunnels big enough to drive buses through, and invented pumps that were the world standard 100 years ago and still are, to build this city that's in the only place it can be, even though it's a bad place. And so I wrote that 100 pages and I sent it to Barbara, and she goes, oh, now I see where you're going. You can keep the title. So I got to keep Floodgates. So another of my fascinations is first contact between Native Americans and Europeans. And Strangers was the book where I explored that because I was at the time living at like an hour and a half from St. Augustine. So I set Strangers in St. Augustine. Whenever I needed to look at the place, I'd just drive over. And I dedicated it to the Americans who were here first. And I spent some time with the city archaeologist of St. Augustine, who has like the coolest job in the world. And he showed me, he's dug up doublet buttons. Where in America can you dig up doublet buttons other than St. Augustine? It's been there since 1565. Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. So I had all this history to work with and only one book to write. So I have a plot that's set at the time of first contact, and then I have a present day plot, and then also St. Augustine was Hollywood before Hollywood was Hollywood. Some of the most famous silent movies were filmed in St. Augustine at the fort. Errol Flynn filmed in St. Augustine. So I have a subplot that's set during the movie era that was a lot of fun to write. And again, I didn't know what the book was about until I finished it, and I realized I was drawing on fairy tale tropes. There's a reason that the beautiful girl behind the window on the cover has very, very long hair. So fairy tales came out in this quite a lot. And those of you who are wondering where the engineering was going as far as the offshore, Plunder was the book where my offshore career came home. Plunder is set in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon explosion. It's set during the 2 weeks between when the explosion happened and the oil came ashore. So when you're writing something suspenseful, a ticking clock like that is very useful. And it was a ticking clock. I spent some time in that area when I was working offshore, just driving back and forth and working with the people from that area. And their entire economy hung in the balance, because what do they do there? They work in the oil industry, they fish, and they have tourism. And all of these things were, hanging by a thread during those 2 weeks. So plunder was my solidarity with these people who have been plundered for most of history. I have pirates in plunder, and then of course there are the modern pirates who take the oil and don't leave much of the money. So that would be plunder. I also have a scene in one of the dive bars that the offshore workers go to, because I got to go to one of those at like 9 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, because that's when you're coming back. So one of my friends was going, I couldn't really picture you writing that scene. And I'm going, I've been places you don't know. So, and to write, I like to do my research. So to write plunder, I went down there while they were doing the cleanup. And so I have a cousin there and a friend with a boat, and we went out. This is Barataria Bay, and they commandeered shrimp boats, fitted them out with booms, absorbent booms, and used them to soak up the water. The barges had drums where the booms were used for disposal. People were fully suited up. You can see we were not. We were in bathing suits. And it was, and it's around Barataria Bay, as far as you could see, there was black staining on the grass, and you knew that it extended everywhere. And I really got the feeling, the sense that we can cause destruction that we cannot fix because it's too big. It's just beyond us. And so that experience, I think, what enabled me to make this book more than it might have been, which is, again, going back to the putting experiences in the well so that you can pull them out when it comes time to write your fiction. This was a little oddball, but I've always been fascinated by spiritualism. There's a spiritualist town in Florida that I had visited. You can walk down the street and have your pick of places to get your fortune told or your palm read. You can go to their church service, which is just like a regular church service, except for they stop and they read people and they do healings in the middle. I was fascinated with that. And as a physics person, I wanted to know how they made the tables fly and the bugles bang into the wall and all that. So I did a lot of reading. I found out how they made the tables fly. And I put it in Rituals, which was really a lot of fun to write. It's set in upstate New York, where the spiritualists started, at the same time that there was the Second Great Religious Awakening and the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights, all of which show in the book. And I have to wonder, what was in the water in upstate New York in the early 1800s? And I love the crystal ball on the cover. And then for now, this is the last of the book, the most recent book. And this came of my experience with contamination assessment. In isolation, Faye is in bad straits. She's in an emotional wreck. She has lost a baby late in a pregnancy that she wanted very much. She's not herself. She may not even be sane. Who knows what her hormones are doing at this time. And she is out doing very poor archaeology, digging for no good reason. And she uncovers a very old kerosene tank and punctures it with her trowel and starts a contamination problem on her island that brings in the authorities, brings in the environmental protection people, who find that there's also arsenic there. Why is there arsenic there? There are actually some very interesting historical reasons that arsenic might be there, which you have to read the book to find out. But it was a metaphor for where Faye was, that she's in this dark place, her beloved island is tainted, and a very good friend is murdered. And she has to bring herself back so that she can make these things right. And Isolation was a lot of fun to write, even though it came from a very dark spot. It just came out last fall. I just moved to Oklahoma last fall, and it was already a finalist for the Oklahoma Book Award. So I felt like it was a nice introduction to my new home. So, what does all this tell us about the topic at hand? Archaeology, crime fiction, science. How does that all come together? I think it tells us that we make a mistake when we think these things are separate. I think that science pervades everything. I think that fiction is rooted in story, which we have used to tell us who we are ever since we sat around fires, or before we sat around fires, perhaps. I think that they're both ways that we find out who we are, and understand the world where we live. I think we do ourselves no good putting science in a box that's intended only for scientists. I think our culture makes a mistake saying that, well, it's okay in our culture to say, I'm not good at science, I'm not good at math, I'll leave that for the people who are. And I think we cut ourselves off from something that's very important. I don't think we should put knowledge in boxes at all. I think that stories are the way that we bring it all together. They are how we explain the world to ourselves. I think story it's obviously related to history because the word story is in history. It tells us who we have been. Archaeology is, the scientific application of our interest in history. Science itself is rooted in the curiosity that my parents ingrained in my sister and me from the time we were very, very small. And then all of it comes together for education, which is the way we pass all these things down. And we pass our knowledge down through stories. It makes sense to learn about archaeology from fiction, I think. So I think our lives are stories, and I think that we use stories to tell the story of our lives, to make sense of our lives. So before I take questions, I wanted to read to you the first couple of pages of the new book, Burials, because in the first couple of pages, I have math, I have geology, I have a bit of physics, I have a bit of biology. I don't think any of that intrudes on the story at all, and I think I do have a story. So I thought I would read that and then take questions from the audience. But this is the first time Burials has had any outing at all, so you're the first to hear this story. Burials, Chapter 1. Powerful forces are constantly at work on a human body that is buried under 10 feet of red clay. Every cubic foot of that clay weighs 100 pounds. For simplicity's sake, presume that the body is 6 feet long. No, make that 5 feet long, because this body once belonged to a woman, and a small one at that. Perhaps her buried form was 2 feet across at its widest point. It was probably less, but let's choose 2 feet for convenience. Thus, she'd offered 10 square feet of surface area to the 10-foot depth of the clay soil that had crushed her. Simple math says that this 100 cubic feet of soil had weighed, and still weighed to this day, 10,000 pounds. It weighed 5 tons. 5 tons of downward force will break bones. It will press the flesh from those bones. It will force the air out of decomposing lungs. Over the years, the overbearing clay had moved ceaselessly, swelling when wet and shrinking when dry. Every rainstorm had shifted the clay. Some of the motion was vertical, some of it was lateral. This slow shimmy had disarticulated her bones, leaving them in a configuration that was almost the natural shape of a woman who lay on her bed asleep, but not quite. The clay had dyed her bones red. Still, she waited for someone to find her. Had she been able to wonder, she would have wondered whether anyone had ever even noticed she was gone. 29 years is a long time to go without a proper burial. Oh, thank you.